Good morning. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Adriana. I'm with the Metcalf Foundation, and I'm really excited to be part of this session and to hear from our three presenters. The goal of today is that we're going to talk about tax policy as a tool for change. And it's really interesting when we talk about systems and we talk about extending impact to think about how can our underlying structures, and tax policy being one of the key things, enable the growth and the expansion and the scale and the sustainability of community land trusts. And so we have three panelists here. We're going to have two presentations, and we're going to be looking at tax policy from different perspectives. At the end of these two presentations, we'll then have a chance for conversation and questions and hopefully dialogue. This is an area that I think is new for some of us, definitely for me. And so I'm really looking forward to diving deep into these themes with our three panelists. We have Colin Anthes with the project lead of Community Wealth Candidates. Francis Peddle, Executive Director of the Henry George Foundation of Canada, and Colin O'Leary, CEO of O'Leary Associates, who's just caught the red eye, or so he is excited to talk about tax policy. He's wide awake. So we're going to start. And afterwards we'll have time for questions. So thanks very much, and take it away.
Thank you, Adriana. So I'm a retired professor. I taught for just retired last year, so now I can do some work. I have time to do work and support things like CLTs and so on. I taught philosophy of law and philosophy of economics for 30 years. And I'm also have been retired for some time now as a tax lawyer. So I've really had two careers, and life has been very interesting to say the least. So I've been involved in tax reform movement for at least 40 years, and I've done a lot of litigation on tax issues over exemptions and things like that. But today I want to focus on two issues. One is I want to talk about a general reform that's society-wide and doesn't just, help CLTs. It would help everybody in a way if we went for this reform. And then I'm going to talk a little bit later in the presentation about some specific things that I think CLTs need to look at as for tax policy purposes and for their own bottom line, really, when it comes to that, because you're all going to be subject as landowners to property taxation in one form or another across Canada. And that's a very complicated mosaic because the provinces control that. Property civil rights under our Constitution is in the House of the Provinces, so to say. So it's their legislation that goes to it. Also, I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes just to get things going, and then my colleague Colin Anthes is going to come in and give you a real-world example from not Canada, but another place. And then I'll come back and talk about some specific stuff, and then we turn the podium over to the other Colin O'Leary from BC. So there is an underlying research paper that once I get some more feedback from the conference, I'll clean up a bit, and it's called Community Land Trusts and the Land Paradox, which you can see on the screen. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on the history of the community land trusts in Canada, just to say I'm very pleased to see that organizations like the network here and in the US as well, for our American cousins who are joining us this conference, there are census being done now. It's new, right? Of community land trusts, how many there are, how many units there are, lots of stuff. And the latest one we have is from 2023 here in Canada. Now, as you all know, the community land trust movement is really starting to take off the last few years, and there is a paper by Josh Barnt and his colleague Susanna Bunce here that kind of divides up that history a bit between a period up to about 2011, prior to that, and then in the last 10 or 15 years. And it's really fun because I'm a part of the or tangentially associated with the Ottawa Community Land Trust, and we really just got going in the last few years, and now we're doing this massive bond issue next week. It's got my colleagues who actually work at the trust a little nervous, but it's a very exciting time, to see all this stuff going on. Next point I want to make quickly is in a lot of tax policy stuff, you're going to need a definition of what, say, a community land trust is. And there's a really good paper, if you haven't read it, I think it's on the website of the network, on legal issues around definitions of CLTs. There is no formal definition in any piece of legislation in Canada of a CLT, but there are stuff that gets identified in policy statements from CMHC and from CRA as well. But definitions make us nervous because we're such a diverse movement. We do so many different things that formalizing a definition in some way, say, for instance, you have to formalize a definition to get a property tax exemption, that might constrict you somehow because exemptions are very, very strictly, shall we say, enforced, and the actual legislation can be very, very picky on these points. Finally, the CLT landscape in Canada is, I mean, I think there's about 50 members in the trust right now. It's fascinating to be here in Nova Scotia and see all the ones popping up here. I mean, it's really amazing. So the landscape itself is changing rapidly, and it's becoming highly adaptable, I think, as far as I can see, to multiple real estate and funding environments. So and also because of this, there's a lot of academic research now starting to be focused on it. So it's good to see some scholars here who are actually getting funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council to do that. Let me get into the thick of it right away. We, of course, have a housing affordability crisis. Everybody knows this. It was very heartening to hear Dr. Jones say yesterday, this ain't new. And I can tell you right now, this is a book I published called Cities and Greed 30 years ago. And I've got a graph in here of land. My shtick is that your biggest problem is land costs, or especially urban land costs. And other issues are basically tangential to that. But I've got a graph in here on land costs from 1980 to 1988 at the time, or 1980. So that's 40 years ago. So the land crisis has been around since the Emperor Heliogabalus, okay? And it hasn't changed. You know, that's the problem for people like me, is that I see the same issue coming up all the time. And so it's very frustrating. So we do have affordability crisis. No government response at any level has ever been adequate to meet it. And I'll deal in a minute for some of the reasons for that. But the affordability issue itself, of course, we do have to quantify when you're doing research. So we have, if you look at my second bullet there, a median to price income ratio or median multiple. It's way out of whack in Canada. We're worse than the US and the UK, if you can believe that, and they're bad enough. Australia and New Zealand are even worse than us. If you look at these median multiples, like the average one in Canada is 5.6 right now, and it was 3. This is household, it's always done on household income, okay, when you do this. So it's the house price in relation to household income, and that will give you the median multiple. All you need to know for purposes of this presentation, and you all know it instinctively, is that it's completely out of whack, and seriously out of whack in the big cities, more out of whack in the big cities. There's a reason for that economically. Now, the two models, the reforms they're going to propose doesn't really go to this, but I think it would help the two models. One is the acquisition model, which is kind of the main model we're working with here in Canada right now. And then there is the supply model, which you hear mostly from governments. We just need more supply because they're of the view that there's a law of supply and demand, and somehow you bring that into equilibrium and that'll solve the housing problem. That is a false principle, in my view, economically, okay? And the reasoning behind it, of course, is that land is limited in supply. It's not as if both sides are elastic in that equation, okay? So you've got a serious problem there that they're not addressing. They mention it occasionally. If you look at the Canada housing strategy, they'll say, yes, land costs are a big barrier to entry and that, but then they go on and say, oh, maybe we can release some public lands for this, which is not very good. My next point, my last point here, and again, I'm not the only person making this, but supply is not the main cause of the housing crisis. For my colleagues here from BC, read Patrick Condon's book, The Broken City. I mean, he makes that point, just published last year. He makes that point really well. I think he's recently retired from UBC. Maybe he'll become more activist like me now that he's retired. It would be more fun. Okay, so let's go to urban land price inflation. I've got a few graphs on this. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but the first one is just the Canadian population versus residential land and structure values. And you can see there, tell me how the laser pointer here. The bottom line here is the population growth. You see it's going up, and then you can see the yellow line is the land growth. Look how that's spiraled, crazy in the last few years. And then the structure values are right there. So this one, by the way, I'll just mention in passing, this yellow line here is very sensitive to interest rates, okay? So that's why housing prices are going right down right now. Structure costs are not going down, it's the land costs are going down. You see how it spikes there. You can see spikes in this around 2008 and the big prices in when interest rates went down. So we all know from economic analysis, extremely sensitive to that. The next graph just shows you land value under dwellings in Canada. And our research organization, Commonwealth, I'll leave some references to them in a QR code at the end of the presentation, but they're doing a lot of quantitative work on this right now. They're like the leading organization in Canada doing this land value analysis. And you can see the bottom tranche there. This one here is dwelling value. So we put it at about 2.5 trillion. These are rough numbers, of course, because our economic intelligence on land value is not good in Canada. We need a lot more work and research done on that. But we know enough to see the land value under the dwellings is that much, much bigger, right? So you've got 5 trillion here and 2.5 trillion there as rough figures across the country. I think this figure here is underestimated. And it's because we don't collect a lot of good data on that. You see it here in another graph. You've got Canadian land value on the left there, the big one. And then you see the stock market, and then you see Canadian billionaire net wealth, 390 billion. Well, we all know that there's a big chunk of land value in that 390 billion billionaire net worth. That's a lot of money, isn't it? They should start giving it to us. And then the stock market too, there's a lot of real estate corporations in there. There are land bankers as well that do these things. The next graph is just on supply. I won't dwell on this a lot, but this graph basically shows that supply is not the issue here. My colleague Patrick Colin, he did analysis of Vancouver. Supply went up more in Vancouver in the last 10 or 15 years, more than anywhere, and the land prices still went. I think the only other city in the world that's more expensive than Vancouver is Sydney, Australia, and so that's how much up there. Now, my favorite one is the next one. This is from Demographia out of Chapman University. They do a lot of analysis of these things. And so the bottom green one here are actual dwelling house construction costs for Winnipeg, Toronto, and Vancouver. And you can see the Winnipeg, we've got low land values there. That's kind of good for land trusts in a way because they'll be able to get in the market. But just look at the inversion in Toronto, Vancouver. So, yeah, sorry, yeah. So you can see Vancouver, look at the top one there is the land value, and the green one down there is construction value. The other thing to notice about this graph is that the construction costs, they're not that different, okay? And that's not where the inflation is in urban land costs. It's in the land or in the urban housing costs. I hate that word house, by the way, because it disguises two very different things economically. And what have I got next? So the land paradox in a way for us is, yes, we are the land people, so to speak, but the central dilemma for us is that land is our enemy as well. That's where the paradox lies. And in a way, we are just market participants like anybody else in this crazy system we have. And what I'm going to focus on after my colleague gives his presentation, which will reinforce this in a way, is that it's unfortunate, but increasing success for us would mean less success in the future in a way, if we don't change the basic dynamics of these things in terms of the land market. And I think that's the end of my little bit. So, okay, I won't dwell too long on this. There's language obfuscations I have in the research paper. I have stuff on inadequate government responses on this. And I will talk when I get up again in a few minutes about the nature of economic rent. A very technical term, but you all know what it is. A piece of land in downtown Toronto is a lot more valuable than a piece of land in the Northwest Territories. So, and that's all due to economic rent based on a marginal theory of utility and productivity. Okay, yeah, and I'm going to skip this one, guys. I'll hand it over to Colin.
Good morning, everyone. Is that pretty clear? Good, great. I come to the land question through a circuitous route. I actually began as an enterprise guy focused on worker cooperatives and democratic business models. And about a decade ago, that led me into community wealth building, which is a method of economic development that has 5 core pillars. You see up there, many of you may be familiar with this already. And it looks at how local, inclusive, and democratic ownership of assets not only produces more equality and democracy, but also important economic multipliers. The wealth goes into the hands of lots of people who live locally, and they tend to spend it in lots of local places. So the money circulates rather than disappearing into gated communities and offshore tax havens. And once that's understood, we find we have tools to build wealth for local citizens on a quite democratic basis, using what we already have in place. We can, for instance, look at the procurement practices of our public and nonprofit anchor institutions, look to gear more of that purchasing power locally, and to prioritize the best economic actors like living wage employers, employee-owned companies, cooperatives, and community nonprofits. From the outset in community wealth building methodology, the Community Land Trust, well before I came to it, was a core tenet or a core practice. That's in part because other practices, while they can increase the vibrancy and prosperity of a given community, which of course is a good thing, that does in turn cause the land values to go up. And if you don't in some way address that, then you can get the negative effects of gentrification, which is the first time I had thought about it that way, and that caused me to do a very deep dive into the land question. The Community Land Trust has become go-to methodology for conceptualizing a land-labor-capital relationship that allows for what the Dudley Street Initiative calls development without displacement. And so it's not just about addressing the housing crisis, of course, but about making our various efforts at building a better economic system to be more successful and reach their full potential. And it's been incredibly gratifying to see this so-called second wave of Canadian community land trusts that was being discussed earlier gather such remarkable momentum and accomplishment and a growing number of resources in a very short period of time. We need that momentum to continue very, very badly. As we look a little further down the road, however, there are some major obstacles we're going to need to navigate around if we are to maintain that momentum. And I think it's useful here to take a look at the case of Scotland and what has happened there. Because Scotland has, first off, a similar parliamentary system to our own. They've uniquely prioritized the expansion of community ownership of land and property. And they're currently unveiling the world's first national community wealth building legislation. So they're a bit of a prototype for those of us on the democratizing side of the aisle. Land ownership in Scotland is historically quite concentrated because of the legacy of the Highland clearances. So when devolution handed more power to the Scottish government in 1999, land reform was a top priority. In 2001, the Scottish Land Fund gave central, single source granting capacity for community purchases of land and property. And 2 years later, the community right to buy gave community organizations preemptive ability to say if and when this property comes up for sale, we get first dibs on purchasing it. There were other reforms as well, but these were the 2 big ones. And we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. This did work. Today, there are about 9 times as many assets under community ownership as there were just a quarter century ago in Scotland. However, increasingly, the imperfect has become the problematic, especially for my slide. What happens if I do this? Nothing. Okay, back we go. Well, imagine I'm painting a slide with my words. Scottish land value over the last quarter century has absolutely skyrocketed. That is in part because corporations have been speculating on the land, and partly because companies that might be involved in, say, the tar sands in Alberta have been buying up rural Scottish land as carbon offsets, which looks an awful lot like corporate land grabs for the sake of greenwashing. Some of the results have included an 87% spike in the value of Scottish estates in a single year. And what that has done to community purchases is both reduced the number of community purchases and greatly reduced the scale. Here, looking at the number of purchases, focusing in on just the first decade after land reform, which you see kicking in about a third of the way into this graph, you see land reform does produce tremendous progress, record number of increase of purchases by record amounts. But already within a handful of years, you start to see that graph stepping back on down and moving towards stagnation. This is what it looks like over the full quarter century in hectares. This is the total amount of land under community ownership. Again, you see that mountain of progress initially, then it starts to slow down a bit, and then from 2016 to the present day, almost a completely flat line, despite much more supportive policies than what we have in Canada at the present moment. Community land ownership in Scotland has effectively stopped growing. And those who are in the community ownership movement are increasingly vocal, and oh my goodness, it's not there again. Well, no problem, I will get the gist across. There's a wonderful statement from Community Land Scotland that I highly encourage you to look up. That is, thank you, very vocal about what the problem is. It's not necessarily about a lack of will, there's no lack of will, or technical know-how, or even resources. Increasing the Scottish Land Fund, which is a good policy on its own, will nevertheless leave community organizations basically impotent to deal with the systemic problem of inflated land value caused by and accessible to corporate speculators. In other words, unless we do something to go after the speculators on the other side, we might not be able to sustainably empower community ownership on our side. And that is, even though we say a lot of things that kind of sounds like that, it is a bit of a mind flip to fully digest that notion. Do I have one here? I do have a slide here, wonderful. And there is some great research by Dr. Kirsten Wright, among others, but she did a great presentation for the Center of the Study of Cooperatives in Saskatchewan here to bring this within a more Canadian lens, and her full presentation is available on YouTube if you want to check it out. But I began my presentation by saying I come to the Community Land Trust looking to deal with gentrification. And she points out that gentrification has its problems that we have to deal with, but there's a different logic and a different set of practices with financialization than gentrification. Gentrification does put prosperity and vibrancy into a community, it just makes it accessible only to the affluent. Financialization is about extracting wealth and vibrancy out of a community. And when we see these corporations coming in and buying up the existing housing stock, that's what we're talking about. And she points out that when we don't understand that distinction, when policymakers don't understand that distinction, which they quite often do not, they focus on creating flat or fair policy landscapes so that everyone can get into a bidding process equally, which sounds nice and inclusive, and it's terrible policy. Corporations are considered safer actors from our financial institutions so they can get lower interest rates. They also have fast capital, which means they can enter a bidding process practically as soon as it opens. You can model this, run simulations, and we have to start talking to each other and our policymakers in terms of the simple, stark reality that those simulations reveal, which is that the extractors will win every bid. So we cannot have flat policy landscapes. We have to have tilted policy landscapes, and they have to be tilted towards the inclusive, the cooperative, and the community. And this obviously is relevant to probably the work that everybody here is doing, and a lot of other people have arrived at similar conclusions through their own path. But I will mention that right after the lunch break, Kuni Kamizaki is going to be presenting on the Case for Community Land Trust, recent publication that came out. And he points out that, of course, these inequalities that we're talking about in real estate markets are structurally racist. And so we have to start talking about how do we empower BIPOC-led community land trusts against the competition that we are talking about with corporate speculators if we are to address the systemic problems of the current status quo. If we are not proactive in setting up these policy landscapes, I suspect that despite the remarkable momentum and growing technical know-how around community land trusts in Canada, we are likely to see a similar stalling out of this movement the way it happened in Scotland in probably the not too distant future. If we are proactive in setting up those landscapes, I think that the community land trust movement can not only play a pivotal role in addressing the pressing needs of the current housing emergency, but can be an invaluable game-changing community wealth-building asset to hand down through the generations. And I will wrap my presentation there and hand it back over to Frank. Thank you very much.
So the tax, on an optimistic note, the tax revolution begins here now. Okay, say, you know, there's only two things in life, death and taxes, but the proper response is, yeah, right, but taxes, death only happens once, you know, taxes are go on and on and on. So the landscape here in terms of tax reform, I would not want to put it on the CLT movement. I'm going to put a few caveats up here first, because I'm somewhat involved in the universal basic income movement in Canada as well, which has made some strides. And, I say, well, you're not really going to get ahead. If we've got these crazy land costs, what's the sense of giving everybody unconditionally $2,000 a month? It's just going to get soaked up by the landlords, right? And so they say, well, you're right, Frank, but the problem is tax reform is a lot harder than UBI. But the reality here is, unless we start to build constituencies like the constituency of the CLT movement, nothing's going to change in this. Get a load of this, most people don't know this, but the last major look at our tax system globally was the Carter Commission in 1966. There has been no systemic look at our surrealistic zigzag pagoda, pestilent greed, which is what the Income Tax Act is. And we need some better research on this. I have proposed this to people in the Liberal government in the past. I always get a plug that I should be the research director, right? Because I'll steer it in a certain direction. But they don't want to open up a can of worms by having like a national tax commission. But we desperately need tax reform at all levels in Canada. So now there's two aspects to my proposal here. The first one is going to be around this whole issue of community-created wealth. Okay, we don't create economic rent or this land value ourselves. It's not something that we basically do. It's a collective public asset. And it's going to be there after we're all gone, too. And it was there before us, obviously. And this problem has been building up for 20 years, so it's, or make it 80 years. But it's going to take, many, many years to bleed this out of the system somehow, right? So my first reform then is to try to build a constituency amongst different groups, the UBI group, the CLTs and that, so that we can all push together on this social remedy. Let me just go ahead. The Bible on this is a book. He was an American philosopher and economist, Henry George, and he published a book called Progress and Poverty in 1879. It became a very famous best-selling book in the 19th century. Most people haven't heard about it now, but it is the anti-landlord, anti-colonial Bible in the history of political economy, okay, if you want to go to the real source of this. And he fostered a big movement all over the world. This is a global movement. He had all kinds of followers in Europe. He went to Scotland, Colin, and made some speeches there. He was put in jail in Ireland. The English landlords certainly didn't like him. And but this movement kind of peaked in the early part of the 20th century, but it's continued, and not one major economist on either side of the political spectrum, they all seem to have different politics these days, disagrees with his argument. They come up with some tangential things why you wouldn't want to go along with this, but just that the politics of it is bad too, because you got very concentrated interests that are going to be hard to defeat what he said. But the movement, I think peaked in around the first decade of the 20th century, but it's come back big time in the last little while. And I think in Canada, with our land mass and our outrageous concentrations of wealth and land and so on, because that's where it mostly is. That's where capital sinks in a way. It sinks in the land. Land is not capital, okay? That's another big thing. It was the guys that came after Henry George in the early part of the 20th century, the neoclassical economists, that transformed land into this ethereal capital thing. And as we've used language here in this conference, commodified land. And that was the beginning of the downfall of everything. There's a few bad actors there, and Alfred Marshall and John Bates Clark and others that we won't name. George ran for mayor of New York actually in 1886. In 1886, and he lost to Tammany Hall, Abram Hewitt, who was the former Speaker of the Congress, but he did beat Teddy Roosevelt. So, and he died in 1897 running again for mayor of New York at the time. And if you were mayor of New York in those days, it was a good chance, you could go on to the presidency. And I can't imagine what the history of North America, maybe the world, would have been if he had ended up being president. I'll just go back then. Okay, so I have two approaches here in my limited time. One is the general one based around the philosophy of Henry George. He called it his sovereign remedy, We generally in the movement use the word or phrase LVT, land value taxation. It's a global movement. There are, for you guys, there are lots of institutes and resources out there to help you. We have a couple now that are getting better resourced in Canada, and we actually have people working on the analytics of this stuff and the impact it would take on our society and on our urban environments and so on. So there's a backstop there for you in terms of research and so on. We also think, though, of course, this is the only way to go in terms of tax fairness and the what we would call the recapture of economic rent. Now, economic rent is just the surplus value that is there in society. It's a law. David Ricardo came up with it. Even Adam Smith talks about it way in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations. John Stuart Mill, even Marx got stuff on rent. The third volume, which most people don't read, of Das Kapital, is basically on Ricardo's theory of economic rent and the explication of that. Marx would take economic rent for sure, but in the Communist Manifesto, he'd take everything else as well. So Georgists don't agree with that. One thing that's kind of reassuring in a way, when you get attacked from both sides of the political spectrum like we do in the Henry George movement, you think, well, maybe there's a chance we're right about these things. Now, recapturing economic rent can be done specifically through let me just go ahead a bit here, through property tax assessment and reform. This is a big issue, but this is where you would start. And we only really have one jurisdiction in Canada that's got good assessments for property tax purposes, and that's British Columbia. Hats off to British Columbia colleagues are here. You guys do it right, because an old colleague of mine, Bob Williams, really made sure that they did it right with the BC Assessment Authority. And one of the reasons why they do it right, part being very professional about this, is they separate the land and building value. When you get your notice of property assessment, you can see what your land value is and you can see what your building value is. And that's very important economic information, because when you tax land, you get a very different thing than if you tax capital improvements. And we call it labor and capital. If you tax that, you're going to get all kinds of dead weight losses and things like that. Land, by the way, doesn't run away, okay? You tax capital, it's going to, these days, it'll go somewhere else. It's very mobile. Labor is somewhat mobile, but not as mobile as capital. You tax land, you're not moving it. We all know where you are, especially with our GIS stuff. So it's also because it increases efficiencies. We have an incredibly inefficient allocation of urban land resources. It's just, I know the planners get a bad rap. That graph I showed you earlier from Demographia, at the end of that report, which they put out every year, but the report last year, they say, well, it's all the international planning orthodoxy that caused this problem. So now everybody in the real estate industry is saying, well, you got to get rid of all these regulations, right? But we're not going to get rid of all the regulations, obviously. But that is not going to be the solution to the problem, because when you tax land values, you stop speculative holding of land. If you increase the carrying charges on these things, developers as / land bankers are going to think twice about what they're doing. A different equation comes into account there. Now, we know the banks and everybody else, they're all counting on appreciating land values, okay? Your house depreciates as soon as it's built. Every human product depreciates, okay? We know building, its economic life, say, is 60 years or something like that. So what we have to do then is make sure that we can stabilize these land costs, drain the speculative activity out of the market. And I think, though, eventually, I don't think urban land costs are going to disappear. I mean, that value is going to stay there because of the nature of the community. But we will, for everybody, make it more affordable. Then I'll just move on quickly to some CLT-specific tax reforms. Now, the first one, I think, is you should advocate for a split rate system. So we would down tax the rate on the building component and make up for it by up taxing the rate on the land component. And you don't have to have a revolt from middle-class homeowners because of that, because it'll be essentially neutral. I mean, most of the studies we do are tax neutral in that sense, right? So we could get on board for that. It's been tried in some U.S. jurisdictions in that, not very effectively, but it's certainly out there. There are some obstacles to provincial legislation to do this, so you got to lobby your provincial government, right? I got lots of city councils in Ontario in the 1990s to go for this, and it always got blocked by the provincial government. So that's in Ontario. That's where our big issue is. Maybe BC will be better like that, or other provinces. The next one that you guys should shoot for is property tax exemptions outright. Now, I'm not saying the Georgians would agree with that, because, you know, if you take too much land out of the exemption, you got to still pay for, you know, municipal services, and that's, so, you know, it's a bit of a tricky one. But I think for us and what we're trying to achieve, if you can get a property tax exemption, it's really important, because it's irrevocable, okay? And it's there as long as you stay a CLT and a nonprofit, and for relief of the poor. There's law on behind these exemptions. Okay, they're built into the assessment acts. Every assessment act in every province has an exemption provision, Section 3 of the Ontario Act, which I'm most familiar with, but they're built on older charity law. Okay, it's called Pencil's case, and so you have to do it sort of for the relief of the poor, and they'll often put that in the legislation. So, for instance, that causes problems, because we have a mixed income property. They're going to say, well, you know, part of your property is not poor; they're paying the market rents, you know, so we can only do it for that. But shoot for an exemption. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we could get a province to say all CLTs in Ontario or Nova Scotia are property tax exempt? That would really go to your bottom line. I mean, your operating costs pay, you know, if you're paying the regular property tax on residential, it's going to be about 15% of that. One of our partners next week on the bond issue, CCOC in Ottawa, just negotiated an exemption with the Provincial Assessment Corporation, and it made over 45 out of 50 properties in their portfolio, and it made a huge difference. It was a brilliant move for them to do it. It was a slugfest. The powers that be, the regulatory authorities don't like giving us this, but it made a huge change to their basic operating costs. Also, don't be shy to do an assessment appeal. I've appealed, and Glenn Green, you'll know this, I've appealed every housing co-op in Ottawa for 30 years. I would just go ahead and appeal it every day. I don't know what happened to be here. So, because, you know, you're non-equity most of the time, or you hold it in perpetuity and so on. So you will, you know, they can't treat you just as another property in terms of assessment. So do assessment appeals. Land transfer taxes for acquisition, try to get out of those if you can. Housing development charges, like 20%. If you're a developer, I know this is not a big one because we're not developing right now, but everybody's pushing for this across the country. Sales taxes on new housing. And also, you know, how the income tax treatment of CLT issue community bonds would be an important thing too. And we have people here who are very much into this. So finally, main thing, we have to recapture community created wealth as a remedy for the CLTs and the land paradox. This would be the transiting paradigm shift for advancing CLTs. You know, if you look at the systems, people, they always talk about how do you make big systemic changes in types of our system, and they go to the transcending paradigm. And then you're going to need professional help often, but do some specific, you know, fighting with the tax authorities or assessments, exemptions and things of that sort, and it will help your bottom line down the road. So that's the name of the paper there. I'll leave this up on the screen at lunchtime for QR code. So Commonwealth Canada is doing the principal research on this right now, and they have a website you can go to for some stuff. And also, I do make a shout out also for the Progress and Poverty Institute in the United States. They're based in Princeton, New Jersey now. They used to be based in New York for 100 years, but a few years ago they moved to New Jersey. They're doing a lot of research and stuff on that as well. So you may want to check out their website and their things. Thank you very much.
Beauty. All right. I'll wait for the presentation to come up. So here we go. So first of all, hats off to all of you. You know, tax policy and reform is super exciting. So, but you know, I love to see that this room is like filled with people, which is really cool. And so that it's really refreshing. It's great because I think you're all realizing this can be some of the next level stuff that can start to happen, right? Which is pretty cool. So we'll go to the next slide. I guess I can do that actually, can't I? There we go. Who am I? I always like to start off with this stuff because I've got a funny story. I sat down, I listened to this guy. He was like a keynote at a conference for like my entire lunch hour. It's like an hour, and it was about organizing your life. And he never really gave his background. And then I kind of caught him in the hallway, and I'm like, "How long have you been doing this?" And he's like, "Oh, well, actually, I just started. This is my first presentation ever." And I'm like, "Oh." And then the next thing is I say, "Well, what got you into this?" And he's like, "Well, actually, I'm very disorganized and I'm horrible with my time. So I figured by becoming a speaker in this, I would get better." And I'm like, I just wasted an hour of my life listening to this guy. So I always like to start with my background, a little bit of credentials, like where am I coming from? So one of the big things is, oh, it's hard to read this up here, I'm realizing, but who am I? My name's Colin O'Leary, and I'm a volunteer director with the Kamloops and District Chamber of Commerce. And the reason I kind of bring that up, and I should actually add to this as well, is that I'm now also, I didn't have this in my slide, the chair and a founding director for the Kamloops Community Land Trust. So you guys got me. I'm one of you now. We started a land trust in Kamloops, and I'm on the board, and we're just getting it off the ground, which is pretty cool. And the oh yeah, we're not gonna be able to read any of these slides. I don't know why the color changed, but anyways, the other thing that I also start off with very quickly, and a lot of you have actually seen me present before, I think, in previous conferences, is that I always start off with this kind of funny pitch, which is like, I'm not trying to sell you anything. That's like one of the first things that happens. And the reason I do that is because it's sad, the reality we live in these days, but the idea of somebody as a volunteer just going out and trying to make system change to help others with no kickback is almost a foreign concept in a lot of our society these days. That's the kind of sad part. And when I try to go and I push this stuff, people are always like, there's got to be a catch. Like he's got to get something out of this, or somebody's got to get ahead. And I can honestly say that this is me bringing my day job expert knowledge to try to actually really make change across Canada. And that's really with policy change. And so policy is really something, like, I am a policy nerd. I'm a wonk when it comes to policy development. I got hooked on it. It's like a drug. I've got some great successes in BC, but what I have to tell you, all of you in the room, because I think this is the next thing, this is what you're getting to, you can actually affect change in this country. So through policy work, we can change the laws that in our country with how things are done. And that is how we can actually really make change. That's how I'm totally addicted to this sort of stuff. And to give you some examples, like, I come from Kamloops, a small town, but we hit really heavy when it comes to policy development, nationally and provincially. And I've got some really cool provincial examples where I've changed the laws in the province of BC to help people. And what I'm going to pitch to you today is a federal tax policy that is in this advocacy kind of realm. But to give you an idea of like some of the other stuff we've been able to achieve with our tiny little Kamloops Chamber of Commerce is, who here, let's see a raise of hands. I'm gonna get you guys moving too, so it's gonna get the blood flowing. You'll wake up a bit more. But who here has heard of the tax-free savings account in Canada? Yeah, quite a few of us. Would you believe that came out of a group of 6 of us sitting at a table in Kamloops, BC? We came up with an idea just like this idea I'm gonna tell you about, and we advocated through the BC Chamber Network. That is our policy. That became law, and then now every Canadian across the country has this going forward. These are the tangible, real things that we can do, which is why you need to pay attention to this, and I need your help because we got to bring this sucker across the finish line. So, and again, I presented in the past as well at this conference a number of times. So in July 2021, I did a webinar with the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts. In 2023, I did another webinar. You might see me in Vancouver. I did a presentation, similar presentation. Now I'm here. And I've been working on it this whole time. And I keep bringing all of you updates because I want you to know what is happening. And I need your help. That's really ultimately a lot of this. And so the other bit of background, so some of you probably seen the presentation before, and I really kind of curtailed the presentation down and changed it a little bit this time because I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about, when I present to outside organizations about this or politicians or I do things like that, I have a whole section of my slide deck where I'm really actually just talking about why community land trusts are amazing and we need way more of them. And so I don't need to do that with you because you've all obviously drank the Kool-Aid, you're a part of that. But for all the reasons that Frank and Colin just presented, I truly believe in my heart that community land trusts offer a real solution to a lot of these problems. So, and what my policy is, it's really actually, it's a tax policy, but it is going to supercharge your CLTs. It is going to catapult you into like a whole new level if it happens. So that's really it. So I'm going to skip all my slides. I usually talk about community land trust because you know that. And the fun kind of story in the background, if you haven't heard it before, is that my father actually, you know, the whole apple doesn't fall far from the tree. He was a successful corporate lawyer in Calgary. He also, his father, like his father before him, we just always, us O'Learys have always done a lot of volunteering our whole life. And so he was on a task force in Alberta to end homelessness in Alberta in the 90s. I always give him a hard time. I'm like, you're way too ahead of your time. That was the problem. Nobody was interested back then, but it's been a problem forever. And now it's like crazy problem. People were interested back then, but now it's grown even bigger. And what he did as part of this is he looked around the world at models that worked and he found land trusts. And so he actually started, he's one of the founding directors for the Calgary Community Land Trust, which has now been rebranded Homespace. Still exists, still doing awesome work out there. And he helped to start up a few other land trusts in Canada. And he's like, well, if this works in the rest of the world, it should work in Canada. And then what happened was that he was sitting around, and shortly after they started it, they realized, oh, that is way better. That's the one I emailed. Like, we can read it now. So one of the things that we realized, or he realized very quickly, is that there was a tax problem in Canada. So they were expecting all these land donations right away, and that's what happens all over the rest of the world. And all of a sudden, they couldn't get any land donations, and they're like, "What the heck is going on?" And it really kind of like it stagnated for a long time. They got a few donations, but not a lot. And the reason that all of you and them back in the day don't get a lot of land donations is it's actually there's a tax problem in Canada, and that's what this policy is looking to fix. So if we look, and I'm going to get into what this is, but because of this, one of the big things that that I would actually really kind of also like to put out there is that because of this, we have a lot of land trusts that own the land that you have is a leased piece of land. And I'm going to get into the reason why there's a huge difference between ownership and lease. And ownership is next level. So we need to get the ownership piece happening. But anyway, so the issue. I talk a lot about land and actually how the value of land is really the huge problem of like affordable housing. So I love to see all those slides and those graphs. I'm totally going to borrow those graphs if I can do that. But in my other presentations, but here's the reality, and I just said this, most community land trusts in Canada have not yet accumulated enough lease income or to acquire additional parcels of land. You're not generating enough of your own money to be able to just go out and buy these things. Some of you are, but a lot of you aren't, right? And so because of this, you're beholden to acts of philanthropy. And typically, a lot of these land donations, what's happening right now is they're coming from government. Have you ever thought about that? A lot of you that have got these parcels of land, it's like from the municipality, or it's from a province, or it's from a crown corp, or things like that. And if you actually stop and think about that, the reason that is happening is because they don't pay tax. So they don't have this problem that I'm looking at trying to fix with your help. And the other thing, I love this, bringing it back to last year, Tom Clement had a presentation. It was wicked. I sat in on it, and it was the first 40 years of Toronto's cooperative housing land trusts. And it was an awesome kind of like, this is what we did, you know, lessons learned, like these are the mistakes we made, if I could do it all again. And one of the big takeaways from his presentation that really resonated with me was anything you can do to own land is a game changer. Because I can tell you, I'm a finance guy really at my core. And when you own land, you got an asset now. You can lend against it. You can do all sorts of other stuff. Plus the beauty is like 99 years later or 50 years later or 48 years later, it's not gone. You've got it. You own it. And that is the real power of a land trust, is to hold land in perpetuity for public benefit. So you want to own it, really. If you really want to achieve what you want to do, you need to own it. So the other flip side of the equation is that, so land trusts need donations ultimately. This is where a lot of us are at right now. The flip side of the equation is corporations and landowners, right? So many corps and private landowners hold land titles for business operations or as passive income for future growth. A lot of them, if they're not using them, they'll sell them right away. They're just gone, bang, they're out of the market like that, right? Shockingly, there's lots of examples where they have this funny piece of property in their portfolio and they it doesn't make sense for them to just to sell it. And so what happens is they sit on it and they hold it in their inventory underutilized, and they kind of can't get it off their balance sheet. So without getting into like the boring finance stuff, if you're a corporation and you've got shareholders, if you bought a piece of property 50 years ago for $100,000 and it's worth $2 million now, if you go to sell that, what's going to happen is it's almost all capital gains, and so half of that's going to go to tax for the government. But the other thing is, when your shareholders look at your financial statements, you're moving $2 million of value off your balance sheet, and it looks bad for shareholders. So it's better for them to leave it on there, even though they're not using it, and they don't actually want it on there. And so it's sitting there totally underutilized. And sometimes also we have people too that come into land. So sometimes you can actually have private individuals where their parents have passed away and they get their home and they sit there and they're like, I want to make a difference for affordable housing in my community. I'm going to donate this home to affordable housing. And they have the same kind of problems that they get into, where most of that value is gone into tax. And so there's lots of situations. We run a lot of analysis, and it really depends on a lot of numbers, like how long have you owned the property, how much to appreciate it, that sort of stuff. But in reality, the core of it is that there's a huge, right now in Canada, there's a huge tax disincentive to just donate land to community land trusts, whether you're an individual or a corporation. Because even if the land trust has charitable status, the tax credit or offset that they get back, it gets eaten up by the capital gains tax owing. So what happens is they donate an asset, so they're down the value of the asset. They're giving up $1 million piece of property, and on top of that, they owe tax on top of that, and they get zero tax credit back. So it just gets to a point where they can't do it. They're sitting there being like, "This is nuts! Like, this is way too hard of an equation to do this," and so that's why it doesn't happen. And because of this scenario, this is the world we live in right now. And there was an awesome example, and I'm actually looking for case studies right now, real life examples of case studies. So all of you start to think about, it doesn't have to be happening right now, but think about in your existence, if you've ever had a close to a deal and it didn't happen, if you've got an example like that where this policy could have brought it across the finish line, this is like one of the few pieces in my kind of strategy that I built of going after government. I would love real life case studies. We want to be able to show the government that this is a real problem and real things will happen if we pass it. But the reality is that we have parcels of land that are held in perpetuity, undeveloped or sold, and there's a huge tax disincentive for individuals or corporations in Canada to donate this land. So what's the solution, right? Like, what is the actual policy? And so one of the things I'll say is that where I've been very effective at getting policy passed and getting change is government doesn't like big change. So one of the best things you can do for a strategy is you can find something they're already doing that they can tolerate, that they can handle, and you tweak it slightly. So then it's like, well, you're basically already doing it. We're gonna tweak it a little bit. And a perfect example of this and what this is based on is the ecological gift program. So the Eco Gift Program has been in existence in Canada since 2006. And what it says right now is passed in the budget. So the federal government proposed to completely eliminate capital gains tax on ecologically sensitive land. And they did it. They passed it. And the idea was to create a powerful set of tools and a powerful incentive for the donation of land for ecological preservation. That was the idea behind it. And from that point forward, any donations of land to an eco-gift using the eco-gift program, they are eligible for a charitable tax offset or a charitable receipt, and this is the big one, they're capital gains exempt. So has this proven effective? Well, they did a little check-in in 2015, and in 2015, when the federal budget reviewed this, over $1 billion worth of land has been transferred using this mechanism. That's over 248,000 hectares, and that's 10 years ago. Can you imagine $1 billion worth of land getting put into affordable housing? You want to talk about a paradigm shift? You want to talk about something that is scalable, that's going to make system change? This is what I'm talking about. And so the other advantage for government is that this, because it's been around since 2006, it's got piles of this anti-avoidance, what they call anti-avoidance stuff in there. And what it means is that it can't be abused for tax loopholes by bad people, because bad people hire bad lawyers who are evil and have lots of money, and they find ways to get out of paying tax and make rich people richer. But the beauty is this thing is pretty watertight, like very extremely watertight, because it's been out there for a long time. They've closed all the holes. So what my policy is really proposing is it's saying to make additions and changes to the Income Tax Act to mirror those already in place, the Eco Gift Program. And instead what we're going to say is if somebody donates land to a community land trust for affordable housing specifically, that donation is capital gains exempt in addition to being able to do a tax credit if your CLT is a registered charity, which I understand a lot of you are not right now. But if this goes through, you should seriously consider that. And it still works for you, even if you're not a charity. But it really hits hard if you also have charitable status. And the idea with this is that it'll allow for donations of land. Yeah, it will open up. If we pass this policy, I'm convinced that overnight, like tens, if not hundreds of projects could start to be happening across Canada with zero need for tax subsidy. It doesn't need money from the government. What we're doing here is we are mobilizing private wealth for public good. We are transferring privately held holdings into a community land trust that's going to hold it forever for public good. That's what we're doing. And so it doesn't need these huge subsidies that it's hard for government to justify and get behind. For this reason, this policy could actually come through the Senate because it doesn't actually have a budgetary ask. So it's really a shift of everything. And what I love about it, because it doesn't have a budget component, is it's scalable. We could do piles of these overnight. Can you imagine if your land trust overnight was suddenly people were like, here's a $5 million piece of property. It's got a high rise on it already. Here's a $10 million chunk of land we want to give you. Can you see how that can change your whole dynamic of how you're operating? And like, it's unbelievable. So one of the things too is that I'm not a marketing person, and I'm notorious for coming up with really complicated bad names. And I have marketing people all the time that are like, that's horrible. Nobody's going to remember that. They don't understand what it means. And so a lot of feedback I got was to rebrand it. And so we have, and previously I've called this thing the Community Land Trust Tax Policy. So I think it sounds great. But anyways, so the idea was to rebrand in something that you know, politicians and other people could really wrap their heads around. And so we're now calling it the Housing Gift Program to mirror the Ecological Gift Program that the government already has. So where are we now? I'm going to fire through some updates here really quick. So I've been working on this for 7 years, entirely as a volunteer. I self-fund a lot of this work myself, just out of my own pockets when I do this, because I'm passionate about this. And so I have, yeah, like even this trip, it's costing me a lot out of my own pocket to come on this trip, but I feel like we need to make a difference. Like, I believe in Canada as a country. I think we are doing a good job, but I think we could do a lot better. We need to tackle this affordable housing crisis, but we need to tackle it in a totally different way. And I completely agree that the last 50 years, it's all this like supply mantra. And it's like, we gotta like get more supply, get more supply. We gotta, you know, make it easier for developers to build stuff. And has that made any meaningful difference to the average Canadian? I would say not at all. We gotta try something new. This tackles a problem from a completely different angle. And this is what we need to start to do. So the last 7 years, I've been doing presentations across the country. I've been talking to as many people as I can to kind of really advocate and push this policy across the finish line. And one thing is that actually a lot of phenomenal connections have come out of the network, actually. And so if any of you have got a great connection and you can help connect me, I'd be eternally grateful. And like, it's these connections and this grassroots kind of movement stuff that really like gets things happening. So, so that's one thing I'd say right away. The other thing is that I try to, what I've learned is you got to make it as easy as possible for the politicians. They got to have the moment of like kissing the baby with the cameras and like be like it's their victory. I'm okay with that as long as it gets legislated. But you really got to like eliminate every chance they have to say no. And one of them was that cracking open the Income Tax Act, I read the entire thing to do this work, and I can tell you what I called it was a patchwork quilt from hell of like policies. It is like 3,000 pages of nightmare. And I like paperwork, but anyways, it's insane. So anyways, yeah. So what I did is I've already actually done the work of, I've proposed, there's actually 33 pages of suggested changes that the government would need to do to make this happen overnight like that. And over this work that I've done across Canada, I've actually had tax lawyers, some of the best tax lawyers in Canada have reviewed it, and they're like, this is super robust. Like, this is obviously Canada has to do their own revisions, but I was trying to do most of the work for them, get it across the finish line. The other thing is that, yeah, we've got the support of the Canadian network of chambers of commerce. So this is one of the things, it's a unique thing that chambers of commerce do that not a lot of people realize is they do policy work, and we're quite good at it. So in order to get this is the second year it's on the books of the Canadian network, and they represent 200,000 businesses across Canada. And so their voice is behind this policy, supporting it as well. And some people will say, well, why the heck would businesses support this? Well, guess what? Workforce housing, like number one, like this impacts everybody. This impacts people on all sides of the equation. And so, and I'll also share with you, like, in order to get this on the books, what I have to do is I have to pitch it locally, get it passed. I have to bring it provincially, and I have to defend it on the floor in front of a big room of people and pitch it that way and get support. And then at the national conference, I fly myself to wherever we're having it. Sometimes it's in Ottawa and other places. And I have to pitch it and defend it on the floor. And I can tell you the last time I did this, the policy passed with 99.6% support, which is actually one of the highest support ratings that has ever happened for a policy. People realize we need this stuff. We have to do something differently. And so beyond that, the policy has been reviewed by Library of Parliament 3 separate times now. They find it robust, and they back up a lot of the proposed suggestions and with data of this makes sense. The policy actually made it verbatim into a policy party platform a number of years ago, and which was really a surprise to me, but it was through a lot of the work I've done with talking to ministers and shadow cabinet ministers in housing. So government can see it on some levels. This really makes sense. My biggest problem is it seems too good to be true. How can everybody kind of win? And so people are always like, what's the catch? There's got to be something there. But the people that actually crack it open and read it and understand it are like, why are we not doing this? Like, it makes perfect sense. Beyond that, I've made like a promotional video to kind of help. It's a short, like 6-minute, because this is complicated and actually talking about it is hard. People kind of like have a hard time wrapping their heads around it sometimes. And so it's a really short, simple video that people will just quickly watch and be like, okay, I understand it now. We also have a whole bunch of resources. I've got a document on the table as one example of like a public facing resource. There's a QR code on the front of it, and I got a QR code up here. And what it does is it actually links to all these documents. So you can have access to all of this if you want to help kind of spread the news. Stuff looks like that. We created a national petition through Parliament. We passed the threshold of the required signatures. This policy has been tabled on the floor in the House of Commons. And that elicited, Krista Freeland had to write me a letter back. And she's the hardest person on the planet to track down, because at the time she's the deputy prime minister and she's also the minister of finance. Oh my God, it's like a nightmare. But anyways, we got her. She wrote back. Her response annoyed me though, because she basically said, oh, no. Right now, the charitable like tax credit will offset like capital gains. And it's like, well, in some circumstances, and in other circumstances, it doesn't, which we can show in some examples. And also, you're missing the point. We don't want to like just make it so people don't get a tax credit. We want to actually create an incentive for people to do this, right? Fundamentally. And it wasn't a lot of times I deal with a lot of ministers in my day job. You get the tap on the head, like, good job. We congratulate you for your efforts. It's like, I don't want congratulations for my efforts. I want change. And so they actually wrapped it up with kind of like, well, we're looking for policy. And it's like, okay, good. Well, look at this stuff. British Columbia Law Institute was actually kind of doing a review and looking at stuff, looking at this and considering policies like mine. If they're here at this conference, I'd love to get an update. This was just like not too long ago, and I wondered where that kind of landed. The Aboriginal Standing Committee on Housing and Homelessness, they're incredible. They've been very supportive of this, and I again, if they are here, I'd love to see them again. But they actually took a few pages in the back of excellent report they did where they said like this could be a game changer. The Hill did an article on the policy, and so unless you're kind of a GR nerd like me, you probably wouldn't realize what that means. But this is a newspaper, it goes around Ottawa, and all the MPs kind of read it, and it's a big deal that it got it in there. We made a written submission for the pre-budget consultation for the fall, which we've done, and we've had a meeting with CMHC's chief economist and senior VP. We've had meetings with the director of policy and the director of research for CMHC. They were both like, all of them were like, this is awesome. Government comes to us for policy ideas. And I'm like, push it through. Like, let's get this to happen. So the last kind of little bit, oh, I am over. Sorry. I'm talking, wasn't paying attention. This is the end of it. I promise. Promise all of you. No more tax. The big thing here is, we still need support. Like, what brings credibility to this policy is all of you understanding it and basically saying, yes, like, we support this. This will help us. So we're looking for letters of support. We've templated letters of support you can access through the QR code, and talk to your MP and give case studies, because that's one of the big pieces where I think government needs to see that this will actually work. This is a real thing and it can really change stuff. So that is it. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I went over. I lost track of time there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to make sure we have time for conversation and questions, because it's a lot to absorb, and I'm sure there's a lot of nuance there. And I find it really interesting in one way when I think about myself as a community development practitioner. Never did I think I'd be following up on tax policy, on CRA policy. And so for many of us, this is like a new area. But when we talk about systems change and scale, and looking at not just what are the strategies that help our individual CLTs, but what can we do as a movement across the board to really accelerate this CRA policy, tax policy is really crucial. And one of the things that's fascinating is that we're a national movement. And when we're looking about changing policy, that is such a strength, because we're constituencies that are active in ridings all across Canada. And that has a lot of power in making change. So I wanted to open up for a couple of questions. We're going to get a microphone because we're being recorded. So it's important to make sure that those online can hear that. But one of the things that I hear are the importance of broadening our tent, the CLT movement, building allies, looking at who else are looking at these issues. Over the years, we've heard people talk about capital gains and tax reform. We know right now there's discussions around looking at tax policy. How does the CLT movement sit within this space? What do we agree on? What do we have different perspectives on? And how do we have that dialogue to come to a shared agenda and see where we can collectively use our power to push and build our constituencies around it? So we've heard things about tax reform, capital gains, from a broad perspective, looking at separating building tax and land tax, and the importance of looking at eco-gifts and how that can be used as a tool that some of us know from the broader land trust movement. So I'm going to get a microphone and I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think, what is your question? And or just share some of your thoughts, and we'll have a chance to have some discussion. And I'll ask you to speak to the mic, or I'll bring the mic over. So I'm going to take a couple of questions at a time, just because I find that's a helpful one. I saw Suzanne had her hand up really first, and then I'll do a couple just to keep it going.
Thanks so much for your presentations. Sorry, Colin, can't really see you. Thanks. So I think my first question to Colin and Frank is, you both had a lot of suggestions for what tax policy agenda for CLTs could be. I think what could be really helpful for the network and CLTs at large is perhaps a set of priorities, like what would be the most beneficial? And I was wondering if you might be able to speak to that. And I think my second question would be for Colin. I really like the idea of doing land donations, et cetera. But one of the things that has come up for me while I'm writing tax policy myself is the question of race and demographic neutrality that is always embedded into our policy work. And that has been a critique of my work, some of the things I've been writing, some of the things that other people in my sector are writing as well. And it's also been a critique I've had of my own work at different times. So one of the things that came up for me is like, how do we make sure that land donations, for example, are not of junk land, and has there been precedent in the ecological reserves precedent to prevent that, and can that be utilized further? Because I think that is a really important piece, especially for racialized land trusts, where it's like, well, yeah, people could offset and donate land that is poor or is essentially brownfield and will require extra work, et cetera. So even though you've gotten the land for free, it comes with strings attached. Like, I know of CLTs who've walked away for environmental assessment reasons as well. So I think if that can be baked into the work that you're doing further, I'd be interested to collaborate further.
Thanks very much. I saw a question here, and then we'll have a chance to answer.
You want to answer first?
No, I want your question, and then we'll let them answer. So
Okay, I wanted to speak to what Colin had just delivered. I'm in the process of turning my house over to a land trust. And I was shocked when I first discovered that I would have to pay tax, a capital gains tax. In my case, because I'm selling at significantly below the value, I will get a benefit. We'll write that off. But it still strikes me in two ways as a negative thing. First of all, it's kind of a government government. Why would you go through two processes? First they tax me, then I get a benefit, and then I write off against the tax. That doesn't seem very efficient. But the other thing is, I've been talking to other people about this and whether they should consider it. And when you have to go through the whole process of explaining, yes, you're going to get taxed for capital gains, but depending on how you sell it, you may not have to pay that, or if you're selling it at, if you're turning it over at the regular price, then you will have to pay tax. So it just doesn't make sense. So my interest, I guess, at this point, after listening to you, is I'd be willing to help in any way I can change that policy, which seems really dumb to me. And I hadn't thought of it before about the environmental bit. And I think that sounds really reasonable. I like that approach. Take something that's already being done and link it to that. I think you have a much better chance of getting it through. Anyway, thank you.
thank you very much. That's such a great example and shows when everyone comes together. So I'll ask to speak on Suzanne's two questions, both on priorities and how to make sure that quality land and it's not prioritizing and reinforcing the environmental and structural racism.
Well, I'll quickly answer on the priorities. I think, first of all, you need to be a part of the dialogue of the global land movement and its relation to taxation. I mean, that's something that's going on. And you know, there's land trusts all over the world, as some of the presentations have shown here today. And there's a lot of other groups working on this. You know, you're not alone here, okay, on that one. So you need to be a part of the dialogue. For you as your own particular land trust, your priority has to be property taxation. You know, the default position in most provinces is that you are going to be taxed as a piece of real estate, just like anything else. And you need to look at exemptions, and you need to look at the assessment itself and appealing that. So, and that will probably require, because it's tax techie stuff, so you will probably need some professional advice as a CLT for those things. So that would be my two priorities.
We can have that in the hall. We're going to keep on just so we can get more questions. Any response in regards to Colin, the environmental quality?
Yeah, absolutely. So I typically get like, there's kind of like three big things that people worry about or they push back with the policy. This is one of them. And so what I can say to you is that it's entirely up to the land trust whether they want to receive it. So people can't, land trusts are not forced to accept like crappy properties, because you're right, like people might try to take bad stuff and dump it on a land trust, but the power, it's 100% of the power is actually with the land trust to decide if they want to accept it or not. And they really hold the balance of power in that equation ultimately. So absolutely, like there is mechanisms in that. It's not land trusts aren't going to get like suddenly like forcibly given a bunch of like crappy industrial land that's contaminated. Absolutely not. There'd be a proposition of like, we want to donate this land. The land trust will then have some time to actually review it and actually decide if they actually want it or it makes sense for them or not. And so, and part of that review, it really depends. It's very site specific, right? And land trust specific. Because some land trusts actually might be like, well, actually, that's not our operating area. We don't want to stretch ourselves too thin. Even if it's a wonderful property, it's like, nah, we don't, still doesn't make sense for us, for what we're doing. Or we don't have capacity to take it on right now. You could, for any reason, be like, no. So it's entirely a gift and your choice 100% whether to accept it or not. And I would also say, I think a follow-up kind of question to that is sometimes people will say, well, you know, what if land trusts aren't sophisticated enough to know that they're accepting something bad? Which I always kind of irritates me because I think all of you are extremely smart people. First of all, second of all, I think you would probably involve a lawyer regardless in this transaction and other people. And like, I think there is a level of sophistication there. And don't accept anything unless you do your due diligence on it, because you know there could be strings attached, and that goes for any property you're going to acquire anywhere, which you're already doing.
So I saw some questions in the back. Yourself, and then Anika, and then Naolo, and then yourself. So I'm going to do all four because I know, and you're just going to hold it all in.
Thank you. So I think the housing gift policy is really a good one. It's going to really shift things and change the landscape for sure. My thoughts are that, you know, to the point of the environmental issues, is there any way that the government can expropriate land without compensation where it's not being utilized? You know, be it buildings that are derelict or land that's not being utilized? Because like you said earlier, corporations are holding on to this land, they're not selling it, it's sitting on their balance sheets, they're not incentivized to. And if they do donate it to this tax, but if the government can extrapolate or appropriate the property and then donate it to the land trust, that could be a loop that could work as well and bypass this tax issue. So just the thoughts and maybe to get your feelings on it, Chair.
So we have a question about land expropriation. Oh, that sounds like Anika.
I was just going to ask, it was briefly mentioned about charitable status and CLTs being charitable organizations. I'm not 100% sure that that's every single CLT's goal is to have some sort of charity status. And I feel like it was really briefly touched on, and I would like to get into the implications of land trusts that might not want to have charity status, or that being like a long-term journey for them. It was just too brief that I would like more conversation on that.
Sure, and that might be beyond the scope from a tax policy, but I think that's also like, what's the broader policy agenda for the network in regards to thinking about, is there movement to be like a different kind of long-term status for organizations that can give out receipts? But it would be great to hear tax experts think about that. Yourself, and then Nolo.
Thank you. So I did share this petition with the National Farmers Union. I'm still on their land access committee. I'm just wondering if there's any specifics in terms of whether it would be able to, if say there's a threshold of how much affordable housing it provides. You know, a farm would be quite different. It could be just one or two farmers in the farmhouse. Maybe the farmers aren't there for a while or whatever, but there's obviously other like sustainability and farmland preservation aspects to it. So I'm been a big fan of this for several years now, and just want to always get your thoughts on for farmland preservation and to stop on the speculation of farmland.
Okay, so thank you so much for your presentations. Just wanted to maybe offer a comment question. The comment part is, I wonder how helpful a decolonial lens to this thinking might be. And the reason why I'm saying this is that if you look at the ecological gift program and you look at the uptake of this and who's been benefiting from that, I don't think you see a lot of the black-led farmers and things like that getting that land, right? And why? So when you look at the program, I think there have to be a qualified recipient, right? And the government decides that. So I wonder how that really, a similar design will kind of really help. And then the other question I had was, urban versus rural, is there a question there? And then my last part of my question is, when you say ownership should be our target, and I understand why you say that, because it allows us to keep the land, but it also goes contrary to cultural values that are more about commons, right? So I think there needs to be some discussions about that, right?
I think this like really speaks to these broader paradigms, right? Of like the land trust in both trying to build like a new economy and new framing, and also the challenge of working with existing tools and structures. So we have 4 great questions that capture both this idea of what are broader tools, CRA policy, looking at how a decolonial lens, and this broader framing, and also knowing that eco-gifts in itself has a framing that usually it's to not develop on the land of eco-gifts, that usually when eco-gifts are donated, it's to keep it at its current status and not to increase its value. And so there's some tools that are models, but then also limitations in that. So how can we start?
I'll just quickly address the expropriation question. Every province has an expropriation act, and there has to be compensation. So there would be a fight over, if you're having a program along those lines to tie into Colin's thing, you would have to have a fight, probably have a fight over valuation all the time, which is usual. So, but I'll hand the other questions over to my colleagues.
I think most of those questions were for the other Colin, so I'll keep passing the mic across.
Yeah, we should differentiate too. We can go, I used to have a nickname in university, Colin O, even though there wasn't another Colin. So if you want to separate Colin A and Colin O, I guess we can do it that way. So yeah, great questions. I also, in my day job, I have some interesting work that involves a little bit of expropriation. Totally agree with what Frank said. It's actually, I think net it would be, and government is very hesitant to do that. So interesting idea, it was a good idea, but I think it just wouldn't be utilized that much. It gets a lot of bad media. The other questions, let's see if I can remember them all. The charitable status stuff, happy to get into it in more detail. You're right. This is such a short period of time to talk about this stuff. But effectively with my policy, in order to create a really powerful incentive, it kind of has 2 components to it. It's like the capital gains exemption, and then where it hits the hardest is if you can also give them a tax credit as well, or offset. That's the biggest like incentive for people to donate land. But if you don't have the ability to do the tax credit or offset, that's okay. It's still an incentive for people to get out of the capital gains. So that's like the short answer for you, is it does work either way. And you're right. I've started a number of nonprofits in my lifetime, and it's a big decision to have charitable status or not. There are strings attached to it. So that's a bigger talk we can have maybe over a beer or a coffee later or something. But and I can share my thoughts personally. And then yeah, the farmers, that's right, excellent. So yeah, absolutely. One thing that could really, and I love, thank you for the support. I really love that. And the one thing that could really work in your favor on that angle is the fact that the Eco Gift program does already kind of exist. And so like there might be an opportunity to kind of like tie them both together if this policy passes, to be able to have like affordable housing and some land preservation for like for ecological purposes or farming purposes. But right now, one of the things I get a lot of questions too from people that want to kind of expand the policy to include like very kind of sometimes very specific like nuances. And the one thing I always say to everybody is what I've learned is we got to get our foot in the door first. This is the way it works with government. If we can get our foot in the door and they pass this policy, it's way easier to do like additions to it in the future. But if we start to make it complicated now, it gives them more opportunities to say no and back away from it. And then the last one, like kind of looking at like the opportunities and like also looking at like underrepresented groups and things along those lines. Totally hear you on that. Absolutely. I can't speak too much to the Eco Gift program and the property, like the donations that have happened. But what I can say is that the way this is written, any land trust, and I've been seeing some really cool, we're actually working on a cool Indigenous housing program with our model in Kamloops right now with Tecumseh Tishikwetmik with our land trust. And I can tell you that the way the policy is written, any land trust, even if there is a specific focus on specific user groups, can absolutely still be eligible for this. And one of the things that Frank hit on, that's another question I get a lot, is like, how do you define a land trust? One of the things that's in the provisions of my changes is you'd have to create basically a registry, and land trust would have to register to be like understood what it is, because otherwise they're all over the map and you can't define it. And so that registry system is would be a very simple kind of thing, but it's still like basically make sure that bad players that create an imaginary evil land trust can't get in there and do this stuff, right? So that's kind of the short version.
And I think that's probably a great lunch conversation around, like, how do we hold these tensions of ownership and stewardship and decolonizing land, and yet at the same time think about registration and doing that. And I can see that some's like, no way. And so the question is, how does one come into a conversation, or how does the network hold that exploration of, is there a shared policy agenda? Is there not? What are the unintended impacts? And I hear that from the first one of, you can invest in looking at tax policy and then all of a sudden land speculation goes up. So how do the themes of ownership, stewardship, purchasing, and policy come together? And I think that's what this session is about, trying to unpack those things and say, it's not about getting consensus, it's about knowing the breadth of ideas that are out there and having discussion and dialogue to say, like, what does this mean? How would this benefit? Who would benefit? And really looking at the strategic intent, but also the unintended consequences and outcomes. Or are we reinforcing structural harms and structural experiences that we do not? And who creates registries and how does that work? Or definitions and parameters. And I think that's the challenge of working within the legal system and the policy structure. So those are really important things for the network to unpack. And that's why I'm really glad that this is a session on the agenda, because what does policy look like for the movement? What does an advocacy agenda look like for the movement? And how can these tools help us think about financial sustainability and broader scale, but also what are the things one needs to think about that, and how does a network hold that? So those, I think, are amazing Saturday lunch conversations. And I'm really happy that we're here at noon. Thank you for your questions. I want to say a huge thanks for our three speakers for sharing their views.